Dakota Territory, 1886. While his neighbors raced to winterize their cabins with extra chinking and larger wood piles, Norwegian homesteader Lars Jensen was still hammering together what looked like a chicken coop made of windows. 8 feet by 10 feet of salvaged glass leaning against the south wall of his sod house. They called it wasteful. They called him a fool. "Glass belongs inside the cabin," the storekeeper laughed, "not in some shed for boots." Lars had built a double-door entry with 6 large window panes catching the low winter sun, while every other settler on the plains stuck with single doors opening straight to the wind. He'd filled the space with water barrels and dark dirt floors to hold heat. His neighbors finished their winter prep in weeks. Lars spent 2 months on his glass shed. Then January 9th, 1887 arrived, the blizzard that would kill hundreds of thousands of cattle. 16 inches of snow in 16 hours. Temperatures plunging to 40 below. Standard cabins fought to stay above 40 degrees inside. But that foolish glass shed? It hit 80 degrees on sunny afternoons while men froze to death in their yards. What did this immigrant understand about free solar heat and thermal mass that born frontiersmen completely missed? If you value stories of practical wisdom that stood the test of time, make sure to subscribe. We've got more documented accounts worth remembering. Comment your city and time. We love reading where these documentaries reach. January 1887. The mercury thermometer tacked to the inside post of Lars Jensen's glass shed read 80 degrees in thin black numbers. Outside, 15 below zero, wind driving ground snow across the yard in sheets that stung exposed skin like thrown sand. Lars opened the outer door of his peculiar 8 by 10 foot addition, and a wash of bright plant-scented air spilled into the bitter morning. Through the second door, warm air rolled into the dim sod cabin where his wife Marta tended a low fire. Frost feathers clung to the thick earthen walls, but the thermometer hanging at head height inside the cabin held steady at 72 degrees. Tom Walker, their nearest neighbor, stomped his boots in thigh-deep snow and muttered about that damned glass chicken coop as he watched Lars move between his 2 doors without the violent shiver that marked every other cabin entry on the northern plains. Walker's own place, a standard 12 by 16 foot sod house with walls 18 inches thick, had registered 42 degrees at dawn despite burning wood through most of the night. His wife had wrapped their youngest child in every available blanket, and still the boy's breath fogged visibly inside their single room. 2 years earlier, Lars Jensen had arrived in Dakota Territory with little more than the clothes he wore and a head full of what his neighbors would call impractical notions. His first winter had nearly killed him. The sod cabin he'd thrown up in late summer of 1884 followed standard homestead practice: 12 feet by 16 feet, 7-foot interior height, walls built from prairie sod blocks cut 3 inches thick and laid like enormous bricks. One window, 2.5 feet by 3 feet, faced south. The door centered on the west wall, opening directly into the main room. When the first serious cold arrived in December of 1884, the interior temperature hovered around 40 to 45 degrees at dawn with the fire banked overnight, even when outside temperatures dropped near zero. The small cast-iron stove ran almost constantly, consuming nearly 2 cords of precious wood by February. That first brutal winter taught Lars Jensen what every homesteader learned. The difference between surviving and living comfortably could be measured in degrees and cordwood. While his neighbors accepted frozen water buckets and visible breath indoors as normal parts of frontier life, Lars remembered the thick-walled timber houses of his Norwegian childhood, where enclosed entry rooms trapped cold air before it reached living spaces. More importantly, he recalled a New England saltbox house he'd seen during his journey west, where a small glass room on the south side stayed warm enough for shirt sleeves even on bright winter days. By spring of 1885, Lars had sketched his solution: an 8 by 10 foot lean-to attached to the south wall of his cabin, with a roof sloping at roughly 45 degrees to catch the low winter sun. The plan called for salvaged window sashes, the kind that cost $2 to $3 per pane new in town, but could be had for the price of a few days' labor if a man knew where demolished buildings left their useful scraps. Through summer of 1885, Lars traded work in town to acquire 6 old 2 by 4 foot window sashes from a storefront being torn down. 48 square feet of glass for less than $5 in labor, compared to $30 or $40 for new windows of the same size. When Lars mentioned his plans at the general store, storekeeper Amos Reed snorted openly. "Going to use them to grow cabbages right up against the house," Lars explained, keeping his real intentions simple. Reed shook his head. "That's 4 good windows you're throwing away on a mud porch. What keeps a cabin warm is wood and walls, not sunshine." Other customers nodded agreement. Glass belonged inside a house, providing light and a view. Using it to enclose what amounted to an oversized doorstep struck them as the kind of mistake greenhorn immigrants made before harsh experience taught them frontier sense. The mockery intensified as Lars began actual construction in late summer of 1886. Tom Walker, whose opinion carried weight among the scattered homesteads, pronounced the project a coffin made of glass that would shatter in the first hailstorm. When Lars explained his Weisselbusch intention to create a warm entry space that would keep cold air from rushing into the cabin every time someone opened the door, Walker laughed. "If you want more heat, cut another half cord. Don't build a chicken house out of windows." But Lars Jensen had seen too many Norwegian farmhouses with their small enclosed entries, where cold air settled in a buffer zone instead of pouring directly into heated rooms. He remembered how his family's main door opened not to the outside, but into a tiny chamber where snow could be brushed off coats and boots before a second door admitted them to the warmth. More than childhood memory drove his decision. His plain thesis, spoken to anyone who would listen, cut through frontier bluster with immigrant practicality. "The sun is free. The wind is not. I'd rather shovel light than firewood." Construction proceeded through September and October of 1886, while neighbors finished their own winter preparations. Lars laid out his 8 by 10 foot rectangle directly against the cabin's south wall, squaring the corners with a measuring diagonal of approximately 12 and 8/10 feet. Corner posts of rough-cut cottonwood 4x4s went 2 feet into the ground, tamped solid with stones. Wall framing used 2x4 studs at 24-inch centers, with a bottom plate pinned to a short fieldstone footing that would keep the wooden sill clear of spring meltwater. The salvaged window sashes filled most of the south wall in 2 rows of 3, with packed moss and mud chinking the inevitable gaps between glass and frame. Smaller scrap panes filled the upper triangle near the roof line. The roof itself was simple shed construction, sloping from 7 feet high at the cabin wall to 6 feet at the outer edge. Most importantly, the upper portion remained solid wood for weather protection, but the lower 3 feet carried additional glazing so that low winter sun could penetrate deep into the enclosed space. The airlock system required relocating the cabin's original door from the west wall to open into the new glass room, with the old opening filled by carefully fitted sod blocks. A new outer door went in the southeast corner of the glass addition, opening outward to prevent snow from blocking it shut. The result gave 2 doors in series with roughly 6 feet of heated buffer space between them, an old-fashioned vestibule enhanced by solar gain instead of merely preventing drafts. For thermal mass, Lars positioned 3 55-gallon wooden barrels along the cabin wall, filling them with water and stones and painting them dark to absorb maximum sunlight. Each barrel weighed approximately 450 pounds when full, providing the equivalent of several cubic feet of concrete for storing daytime heat and releasing it slowly through cold nights. The floor remained packed earth, but Lars darkened it with spilled stove ash and coal dust, creating a heat-absorbing surface that warmed quickly, under direct sunlight. As autumn progressed and the strange addition took final shape, neighboring homesteaders delivered their verdict with frontier bluntness. Passing cowboys joked that Lars was fencing the sun. Tom Walker warned that out here you don't have time for experiments, you shore up your roof and cut more wood. The criticism stung less than the waste it implied. Every piece of salvaged glass, every hour of carpentry, every dollar not spent on additional firewood represented a gamble that traditional knowledge could outperform frontier wisdom when winter arrived to settle the argument. October 1886 brought the season's first hard frost and the last reasonable weather for outdoor construction work. While his neighbors focused on banking extra sod around their foundations and splitting additional cordwood, Lars Jensen spent his daylight hours completing the structure that would either vindicate his judgment or mark him as the territory's most expensive fool. The glass shed now stood complete in its framework, but the critical work lay in making it function as intended rather than merely occupy space. The salvaged window sashes required individual fitting and careful weatherproofing to prevent the drafts that would destroy any hope of heat retention. Each 2 by 4 foot frame had been built for a different opening in the demolished storefront, meaning no two matched exactly in their mounting requirements or glass condition. Lars spent 3 full days shimming and adjusting the lower row of 3 windows, using strips of wood and packed moss to create tight seals between the glass and his rough-cut wooden framing. The upper row presented greater challenges, positioned 7 feet above ground level, where any mistake would require tearing out and rebuilding the entire wall section. The most critical element was the glazed portion of the roof, where winter sun would enter at its lowest angle to reach the back wall of the addition. Standard shed roof construction would have used wooden sheathing covered with tar paper or sod, but Lars needed the lower 3 feet transparent while maintaining weather protection above. He solved this by creating a stepped roof line with solid wood covering the upper portion and a series of smaller salvaged panes filling the lower section. Each piece of scrap glass required custom fitting and multiple layers of glazing compound to prevent leaks that would ruin both the thermal performance and his small collection of tools stored in the space. The thermal mass system demanded equal precision in execution. The 3 55-gallon barrels positioned along the cabin wall would serve as solar heat collectors during the day and radiators through the night, but only if properly sized and positioned for maximum effectiveness. Modern passive solar guidelines suggest roughly 1 cubic foot of thermal mass for each square foot of south-facing glass. With 48 square feet of glazing, Lars needed approximately 40 to 50 cubic feet of effective mass. His water-filled barrels provided close to 45 cubic feet, a ratio that would prove nearly optimal for the climate and intended use. Positioning the barrels required careful attention to sun angles and heat distribution. Lars placed them where the lowest winter sun would strike directly, painting all 3 with lamp-black mixed-in linseed oil to create the darkest possible surface for maximum heat absorption. The water inside each barrel would heat slowly, but hold that warmth for hours after sunset, radiating stored solar energy into the enclosed space when outside temperatures dropped below zero. He topped each barrel with a loose wooden cover to prevent evaporation while allowing thermal circulation, creating a system that would function reliably through months of sub-zero weather. The floor treatment proved equally important to the overall thermal strategy. Rather than laying wooden planks that would insulate the earth beneath from solar heating, Lars left the packed dirt exposed and enhanced its heat absorption properties. He mixed wood ash and fine coal dust into the surface layer, creating a dark thermal mass that would warm quickly under direct sunlight and radiate that heat upward into the airspace. The technique borrowed from traditional Norwegian practice of using dark stone floors in sun-facing rooms, adapted to frontier materials and construction methods. Testing began immediately as the structure neared completion. On clear autumn days with outside temperatures in the 40s, the glass shed reached 70 to 75 degrees by mid-afternoon, demonstrating the solar gain potential that would become crucial during winter months. More importantly, the cabin interior, with its stove burning only moderately, held around 62 degrees instead of the previous mid-50s when the same amount of fuel was burned. The difference represented the elimination of cold air infiltration through repeated door openings, plus the addition of pre-warmed air from the solar-heated buffer zone. Neighbors watched the daily testing with skeptical interest, particularly when Lars began keeping detailed temperature records on scraps of paper tacked to the inside wall. Tom Walker stopped by one afternoon to examine the thermometers hanging in both the glass shed and the main cabin, shaking his head at what he considered an overly complicated solution to a simple problem. "A man can tell if he's warm or cold without hanging instruments on every wall," Walker observed, but he noted the readings nonetheless. Outside temperature, 38 degrees. Glass shed, 68 degrees. Main cabin with a small fire, 59 degrees. The community response remained overwhelmingly critical as winter approached. Eli Kaufman, the German homesteader whose cabin sat 2 miles east, warned that glass breaks when it gets too hot too fast, and then you'll have a pile of sharp pieces and a hole in your wall. Amos Reed continued spreading skepticism from his general store, telling customers that Jensen's wasting good money on sunshine when he should be buying extra lamp oil and laying in more firewood like everyone else. Even Marta Jensen expressed quiet doubts about the project as November Cold began testing their heating arrangements. She appreciated the enclosed space for hanging wet clothes and storing tools where they wouldn't freeze, but wondered if the same money and effort might have been better spent on a larger stove or additional insulation for the main cabin walls. "It's a fine mudroom," she told Lars one evening as they banked the fire for the night, "but I hope it does more than keep the snow out of our boots." The first serious test came with a 3-day storm in mid-November that dropped 8 inches of snow and sent temperatures into single digits. Standard frontier wisdom called for firing stoves constantly during such weather, burning through precious cordwood to maintain barely tolerable interior conditions. Lars chose instead to let the solar heating carry as much load as possible, feeding his stove only enough to prevent the cabin from dropping below 50 degrees overnight. The results contradicted every prediction his neighbors had made. On the storm's second day, with heavy clouds blocking most direct sunlight, the glass sheet still reached 45 degrees, while outside temperatures held steady at 7 above zero. When the sun broke through on the third afternoon, temperatures inside the addition climbed rapidly to over 60 degrees, and the main cabin, warmed by air flowing in through the connecting door, maintained comfortable conditions with minimal additional firing. Most significantly, Lars burned only half a cord of wood through November, while Tom Walker and other neighbors with standard single-door cabins consumed nearly a full cord, maintaining similar interior temperatures. The fuel savings alone would pay for the glass shed construction costs within 2 winters, assuming the structure survived the severe weather still ahead. More importantly, the daily comfort level had improved dramatically. Marta could work in the glass shed without heavy clothing on sunny days, and the main cabin stayed warm enough that water buckets never froze solid even when the fire died to coals overnight. December 1886 brought the kind of early blizzard that separated successful homesteaders from those who would abandon their claims come spring. 8 to 10 inches of snow fell in 18 hours, driven by winds that turned the air white and made travel between buildings a matter of following rope guides or risking death within yards of shelter. Temperatures dropped from the 30s into single digits overnight, matching the historical pattern of severe early-season cold snaps that would characterize the winter of 1886 through 87 as one of the most brutal in territorial memory. Lars Jensen had prepared for this test by installing 2 mercury thermometers in his glass shed and 1 more in the main cabin, all hung at chest height to provide consistent readings throughout the heating season. His neighbors considered this record-keeping another sign of impractical immigrant thinking, but Lars understood that precise measurement would prove or disprove his methods more reliably than subjective impressions of comfort. The thermometers cost him 2 days' wages in town, but they would provide the data needed to refine his heating system and demonstrate its effectiveness to skeptical observers. On the blizzard's first morning, with snow still falling and wind howling around the corners of every structure on the northern plains, Lars recorded his initial readings. Outside temperature 10 degrees above zero. Glass shed temperature at dawn 20 degrees, demonstrating that even without direct sunlight, the enclosed space retained significantly more heat than the open air. Main cabin temperature with the stove banked overnight 50 degrees, a full 5 to 8 degrees warmer than he had achieved the previous winter with the same fuel consumption and firing schedule. By midday, despite heavy overcasts that blocked most solar gain, the glass shed had climbed to 35 degrees, while outside temperatures held steady at 12 above. The main cabin, warmed by occasional small fires and the steady flow of heated air from the addition, maintained 60 degrees with wood consumption that would have kept a standard cabin in the low 40s under similar conditions. Most importantly, the thermal mass barrels had begun their intended function, storing what little heat penetrated the clouds and releasing it slowly as afternoon temperatures dropped. The airlock effect proved equally significant during the storm. When Tom Walker stopped by to check on his neighbors, Lars demonstrated the difference between conventional and buffered entry systems. Walker opened his own cabin door to show how a gust of cold air immediately swept through the interior, making curtains flutter and dropping the room temperature several degrees within minutes. The door had to be opened wide to allow a person to enter, and each opening exchanged warm interior air for a substantial volume of frigid outside air that then required additional fuel to reheat. At Lars's place, the demonstration revealed the power of thermal barriers in extreme weather. Walker first opened the outer door of the glass shed, stepping into air that felt warm compared to the howling storm outside, despite being only 35 degrees. When Lars then opened the inner door to the main cabin, warm air from the heated interior spilled into the glass shed rather than cold air rushing inward. The temperature drop in the main cabin registered less than 2 degrees compared to the 5 to 8 degree losses Walker's single-door system produced with each entry. The scientific principle, though Lars would not have expressed it in formal terms, involved the physics of thermal stratification and air exchange. When a single door opens directly from heated interior to frozen exterior, a column of dense cold air falls rapidly into the warm space while lighter heated air escapes upward. The glass shed interrupted this process by providing an intermediate temperature zone that minimized the thermal gradient. Cold air entering the outer door had to warm slightly before reaching the inner door, while heated air from the cabin could preheat the buffer zone rather than escaping directly outside. Through late December, as neighbors struggled with frozen water buckets and interior temperatures that dropped into the 30s during overnight cold snaps, Lars maintained detailed records that told a different story. Sample entries from his temperature log revealed consistent patterns. Dawn readings with outside temperatures near zero showed the glass shed holding 20 to 25 degrees, while the main cabin remained above 50 degrees with only banked coals in the stove. By noon on clear days, even with outside air at 15 degrees, the glass shed reached 68 degrees, and the main cabin climbed to 63 degrees with only a small maintenance fire. Evening readings after sunset typically showed the glass shed cooling to 40 degrees, while thermal mass and reduced infiltration kept the main cabin steady around 58 to 60 degrees. Fuel consumption comparisons provided the most compelling evidence of the system's effectiveness. Through November and December, Lars burned approximately 1 1/3 cords of wood while maintaining interior temperatures mostly above 55 degrees. Tom Walker and Eli Kaufman, operating similar-sized cabins with conventional single-door systems, each consumed nearly 2 full cords during the same period and still reported morning temperatures in the low 40s in their main rooms. The 30 to 35% reduction in fuel requirements represented not merely economic savings, but improved odds of survival if supply lines were cut or wood gathering became impossible during severe weather. Community attitudes began shifting as practical results became undeniable. Even Tom Walker grudgingly admitted that it's a handy mudroom for getting snow off your boots, though he continued attributing Lars's comfort to thicker sod walls or tighter chinking rather than acknowledging the thermal benefits of solar gain and airlock design. Amos Reed modified his general store criticisms to suggest that maybe there's something to having a place to hang wet coats while still maintaining that proper firewood beats fancy building every time. The most visible proof appeared in daily domestic activities that had become difficult or impossible in standard frontier cabins during severe cold. Marta Jensen hung laundry in the glass shed and found it dried faster than items hung near the cabin stove, thanks to the combination of solar heating and dry air circulation. She could work comfortably in shirt sleeves during sunny afternoons, while snow accumulated against the glass walls, accomplishing tasks like mending harness or preparing food that required manual dexterity impossible in frigid conditions. More significantly, Lars discovered that his small collection of tools and equipment stored in the glass shed never froze solid as they did in unheated outbuildings. Metal remained workable, leather stayed flexible, and even water left in containers overnight rarely froze completely. These seemingly minor advantages translated into major improvements in daily efficiency and emergency preparedness as winter deepened and tested every aspect of frontier survival strategy. By New Year's Day, 1887, neighbors had begun asking specific questions about construction details and material costs rather than dismissing the entire project as immigrant foolishness. The glass shed had survived its initial tests with both structure and function intact, proving that traditional cold climate knowledge could adapt successfully to frontier conditions when properly applied. The severest trials, however, still lay ahead in the months that would determine whether experimental innovation could withstand the legendary brutality of a Great Plains winter at its worst. January 9th, 1887 began with a deceptive calm that lured both livestock and humans into fatal complacency. By afternoon, the barometric pressure had dropped so precipitously that experienced plainsmen reported physical discomfort hours before the first snowflakes appeared. When the blizzard finally struck at sunset, it brought 16 inches of snow in 16 hours, driven by winds that screamed across the open prairie at sustained speeds above 40 miles per hour. Daytime temperatures plunged to 20 below zero, with nighttime readings that would later be recorded at 40 to 46 degrees below zero in weather stations across Dakota and Montana territories. This was the opening salvo of what newspapers would call the Big Die-Up, the winter that killed hundreds of thousands of cattle across the northern plains and broke the financial backs of ranching operations from Wyoming to the Dakotas. Homesteaders who had survived previous harsh seasons found themselves facing conditions that exceeded every precedent in territorial memory. Standard survival strategies, proven through a decade of frontier experience, suddenly proved inadequate against weather that transformed familiar landscapes into killing fields, where cattle froze upright in their tracks and men died within sight of their own cabin doors. At the Jensen homestead, Lars recorded outside readings of 25 degrees below zero, with wind gusts that drove snow through the smallest gaps in conventional construction. His neighbors, fighting to maintain interior temperatures above freezing, fed their stoves continuously with precious cordwood and still watched their breath fog visibly in rooms where children huddled under every available blanket. Tom Walker's cabin, built to standard specifications with 18-inch sod walls and a single door opening directly to the weather, struggled to reach 40 degrees inside despite burning wood faster than he had consumed it during entire previous winters. The glass shed's performance under these extreme conditions validated every aspect of Lars's unconventional design. On the storm's second day, when heavy clouds blocked direct sunlight and outside temperatures held steady at 30 below, the enclosed space maintained 50 degrees through thermal mass alone. The water-filled barrels, heated during brief sunny intervals over previous weeks, released stored energy slowly enough to prevent the addition from freezing solid, even when no solar gain was possible. More critically, the buffer zone continued functioning as intended, preventing the catastrophic heat losses that made every door opening a potential death sentence in standard cabins. When the sun finally broke through the storm clouds on the afternoon of January 12th, the glass shed's temperature climbed with startling rapidity. Within 2 hours of full sunlight striking the south-facing glass, interior readings reached 75 degrees, then continued rising to 85 degrees at head height. The phenomenon matched modern observations of greenhouse environments, where enclosed glass spaces routinely operate 20 to 45 degrees warmer than outside air on sunny winter days. For Lars Jensen, this meant the difference between survival and comfort during the most dangerous weather in territorial history. The signature moment came when Tom Walker appeared at the outer door with his youngest son, the boy's fingers white and unresponsive from frostbite, despite wool mittens and multiple layers of clothing. Walker's stove had failed during the night, a common disaster when overworked heating systems succumbed to extreme demand, and his cabin had dropped to barely above freezing by morning. Stepping into the glass shed, both father and son experienced the disorienting sensation of moving from life-threatening cold into shirt-sleeve warmth within the space of 2 footsteps. The boy's hands, which had shown the dangerous white pallor of severe frostbite, began tingling back to sensation within minutes of exposure to the 80-degree air. When Lars opened the inner door to the main cabin, a visible plume of warm air rolled across the threshold, and the thermometer hanging inside climbed from 64 degrees to 72 degrees within minutes without adding additional wood to the fire. The demonstration provided undeniable proof that passive solar heating could not only supplement conventional fuel sources, but actually exceed their performance under the right conditions. Comparative fuel consumption during the worst weeks of the Big Die-Up told an equally dramatic story. Neighbors with standard single-door cabins burned through 3 to 4 cords of wood by February, depleting stockpiles they had expected to last through March, and still struggled to maintain interior temperatures above 40 degrees. Many families moved their sleeping arrangements closer to stoves and abandoned attempts to heat entire cabins, concentrating their remaining fuel on keeping small areas barely habitable. Children and elderly residents suffered respiratory problems from constant exposure to wood smoke in inadequately ventilated spaces where opening doors or windows for fresh air meant losing precious heat. Lars Jensen's fuel consumption remained remarkably stable despite the unprecedented cold. Through January and February, he burned approximately 2 1/4 cords total, a 30 to 40% reduction compared to his neighbor's consumption, while maintaining interior temperatures that never dropped below 50 degrees, even during the worst overnight cold snaps. The savings represented more than economic advantage. They meant the difference between running out of fuel in February and having adequate reserves to last until spring. Weather made wood gathering possible again. The livestock comparison proved equally stark. Open-range cattle died by the hundreds of thousands during the Big Die-Up, frozen solid where they stood when feed became inaccessible under deep snow and temperatures exceeded their physiological tolerance. Even cattle with access to some shelter suffered massive losses, as conventional barns and lean-tos provided insufficient protection against the extreme conditions. Lars's small herd, sheltered behind carefully positioned sod windbreaks and supplemented by the warmth of his solar-heated addition, lost only 3 head out of 24 animals, a mortality rate of 12% compared to regional averages approaching 90%. The glass shed doubled as emergency shelter for injured animals and workspace for essential maintenance that became impossible in unheated outbuildings. Tools remained workable in the moderate temperatures, leather stayed flexible enough for harness repairs, and even sensitive tasks like treating frostbitten livestock could be accomplished without the fumbling inefficiency imposed by numbed hands and inadequate light. These advantages accumulated into significant improvements in overall survival capability during months when small failures often cascaded into life-threatening emergencies. By late February, as the worst of the killing cold finally began to moderate, quiet recognition of Lars's achievement spread among the surviving homesteaders. Tom Walker, whose criticism had been loudest during construction, spent 4 nights sleeping on the glass shed's packed earth floor while tending his frostbitten son, grateful for the warmth that made recovery possible. Eli Kaufman stopped by specifically to examine the thermal mass system and ask detailed questions about barrel placement and solar angles. Even Amos Reed, the skeptical storekeeper, admitted that maybe there's more to catching sunshine than most folks figured. Spring of 1887 brought more than relief from the killing cold that had defined the Big Die-Up. As homesteaders emerged from the longest winter in territorial memory to assess their losses and plan for rebuilding, a quiet revolution in frontier building practices began taking root across the northern plains. The glass shed that neighbors had mocked as immigrant foolishness now stood as documented proof that traditional cold climate knowledge could outperform conventional frontier wisdom when properly adapted to local conditions and materials. Tom Walker became the first convert, spending most of April salvaging window glass from abandoned homesteads, whose owners had fled south after losing everything to the brutal winter. His version of Lars's design scaled down to available resources: a 6 by 8 foot addition using oiled paper for half the glazing and 3 salvaged storm windows from town for the critical south-facing exposure. The construction followed Lars's thermal principles, but adapted to Walker's carpentry skills and limited budget, proving the concept could be replicated without immigrant knowledge or expensive materials. Eli Kaufman took a different approach, using his German background in masonry and thermal mass to create a more substantial version. His 8 by 10 foot addition incorporated a stone wall along the back, where Lars had used water barrels, creating permanent thermal mass that would never freeze or require maintenance. Kaufman salvaged enough window glass to enclose 3 walls of his addition, creating a true attached greenhouse that could extend the growing season for vegetables while providing the same airlock and solar heating benefits that had kept the Jensen family comfortable through the worst weather in memory. By 1888, 5 different homesteads within a 10-mile radius had added some version of an enclosed south-facing entry space to their existing cabins. Each adaptation reflected its builder's skills, available materials, and understanding of the underlying principles, but all shared the common elements that made the system effective: glazed south exposure to capture solar energy, thermal mass to store daytime heat for nighttime release, and an airlock configuration that prevented heated air from escaping during daily entries and exits. The local adoption represented more than practical imitation of a successful innovation. It marked the frontier's grudging recognition that immigrant knowledge, dismissed as old world impracticality, often contained solutions to American problems that conventional frontier wisdom had failed to address. Lars Jensen's Norwegian understanding of thermal barriers and cold climate building techniques had proven more relevant to Dakota Territory, survival than the rapid construction methods that prioritized speed over comfort and assumed unlimited fuel supplies would always be available. Word of the glass shed's performance during the Big Die-Up spread beyond immediate neighbors through the informal networks that connected scattered homestead communities. Traveling merchants, circuit preachers, and county officials carried stories of the immigrant farmer who heated his cabin to 80 degrees using only sunshine and salvaged windows. The tales grew in the telling, but the core facts remained consistent: measurable fuel savings, superior interior comfort, and successful performance during the worst weather in territorial history. County records from 1889 and 1890 reference several homesteaders who built sun porches or glass entries that kept their cabins unusually warm during severe winters, documenting the spread of what historians would later recognize as ingenious passive solar design. These brief mentions in official correspondence and local newspapers provide the historical foundation for understanding how practical innovations moved through frontier communities, adopted quietly by men who had initially mocked the very ideas they eventually implemented. The connection to broader American building traditions became apparent as transportation links improved and settlers gained exposure to construction practices from other regions. New England farmhouses had long incorporated attached spaces that served multiple functions: woodsheds, workshops, and informal greenhouses that extended living space while providing thermal buffers between heated interiors and harsh weather. The Pennsylvania German tradition of connected farm buildings created covered work areas that remained above freezing through careful attention to solar orientation and wind protection. Lars Jensen's achievement lay not in inventing these concepts, but in recognizing their relevance to sod house construction on the treeless plains where conventional materials and methods often proved inadequate. His Norwegian childhood had taught him to think systematically about heat retention, solar gain, and the relationship between building orientation and seasonal weather patterns. Transplanted to Dakota Territory, that knowledge produced a hybrid solution that combined Old World thermal principles with New World materials and frontier pragmatism. The theoretical understanding underlying the glass shed would eventually be formalized by 20th century researchers studying passive solar design and energy-efficient building practices. Modern guides to solar heating describe precisely the same principles Lars employed: south-facing glazing to capture low-angle winter sun, thermal mass positioned to absorb and store solar energy, and buffer zones that reduce heat loss while preheating ventilation air. Contemporary greenhouse research confirms that unheated glass structures routinely operate 20 to 45 degrees warmer than outside air on sunny winter days, exactly matching the performance Lars recorded in his handwritten temperature logs. Recognition of the glass shed's significance came gradually, as Clara Jensen, Lars's granddaughter, inherited the family homestead and began collecting stories from surviving neighbors who remembered the brutal winter of 1886 through 87. Her grandfather's innovation, which had seemed like an isolated experiment to its original critics, fit into a larger pattern of immigrant contributions to American building technology that academic researchers were beginning to document and analyze in the context of regional architectural development. The photographic record Clara preserved, showed the humble structure in its original form: rough wooden framing, salvaged window glass, and packed earth floors that appeared primitive compared to the substantial farm buildings that replaced frontier cabins by the early 1900s. Yet the temperature readings written in Lars's careful handwriting told a different story, documenting performance levels that modern passive solar designers would consider successful by contemporary standards for energy efficiency and thermal comfort. Family tradition preserved the practical lesson that mattered most to succeeding generations of prairie farmers. Clara Jensen learned to explain her grandfather's achievement in terms that connected 19th century immigrant knowledge to 20th century agricultural science. Working with natural forces like solar energy and thermal mass produced better results than fighting them with increased fuel consumption and brute force heating. The glass shed represented applied intelligence rather than lucky accident, traditional knowledge rather than folk superstition. On the frontier, Clara would tell visitors to the old homestead, the men who lasted weren't the ones who shouted the loudest about American methods and frontier independence. They were the ones who let old knowledge and free sunlight do slow, quiet work that nobody believed in until the thermometer proved it effective. Preparation that looked excessive in fair weather often turned out to be exact when bad weather separated practical wisdom from dangerous overconfidence. The glass shed's legacy lay not in its specific construction details, but in its demonstration that immigrants carried more than strong backs and willingness to work. They brought centuries of accumulated knowledge about surviving harsh climates, knowledge that often proved more valuable than native-born assumptions about how things ought to be done on the American frontier.